Welcome, everyone. Insects are fascinating creatures, and there is a staggering diversity of them. There are over 6,000 species of insect pollinators in the UK, including bees, flies, butterflies, and moths. Many of these lead amazing lives right under our noses, and of course, we are dependent on them to pollinate many of the things that we eat. Our Gardens project focuses heavily on helping pollinators, so I'll just hand over to Julie to explain a bit about that.
Right, thank you. So as you may know, we have a citizen science project to increase pollinators in participants' gardens over a period of 3 years. We've currently issued guidance to the participants about pollinator-friendly plants, and they're busy sowing seeds and planting. We want them to monitor the increase in pollinators so that we can refine our plant list and guidance, because what we'd like to do is roll it out to new members in the wider community in time and get more people helping pollinators. Ideally, we want the participants to survey their gardens once a month to look for a list of key species while they're active, and they will then record them on iRecord. We needed the participants to identify our list of key species when they do their garden surveys, and that led us to approach Alice Parfitt, who kindly agreed to assist us with this talk. We thought it was something that all of our members would appreciate, so we've decided to open it up to all of you to enjoy too. The garden project is still open for additional participants if anyone's interested. It's not too late. We'll still be starting our species monitoring in June, and you can email the group's email address to sign up, and I'll put that in the chat shortly. All right, I'll hand back to Sue now.
Thanks, Julie. So our guest speaker tonight is local ecologist and conservationist Alice Parfitt. Alice lives in Storrington and has over 20 years of experience working for a range of wildlife conservation organisations, such as the Wildlife Trust, Sussex Wildlife Trust, the RSPB. Her work includes nature reserve management, pollinator conservation, and land management advice. She currently works as a conservation officer with Buglife on a project called Changing Chalk on the Eastern Downs, which involves advising landowners, farmers and communities how they can get involved with pollinator conservation. She is also an active member of the NEP Safaris team. Alex is passionate about biological recording and loves all invertebrates, especially hoverflies. Tonight, Alice is going to share her expert knowledge about the diversity and ecology of these amazing insects and the threats facing them. She'll also give us some tips on how to identify them and what we can all do to help with their conservation. If you would like to ask Alice a question, please feel free to add it to the chat, which you will find at the bottom of your screen as and when it occurs to you. Alternatively, if you want to raise a question at the end, you can raise your electronic hand. You can also do this by clicking on reactions at the bottom of the screen and then on raise your hand. Okay, so over to you, Alice.
Okay, hello everybody. Right, I am going to attempt to share my screen. Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. So yes, my name is Alice Parfitt. I do work for Buglife, but I live in Storrington. So it's nice to see lots of Storrington residents interested in pollinating insects. So this evening, I'm obviously going to talk about our pollinators, who they are, why they're important, a few tips on identifying some of them, and a few tips on what we can all do to help them out. So for those of you that, right, okay, just having an interesting moment as I can't seem to just move my slides on. There we go, I've done it now. Okay, so yeah, I work for Buglife, and we're the only organisation in Europe devoted to the conservation of all invertebrates. So our aim is to stop invertebrate extinctions and achieve sustainable populations of all invertebrates. As just mentioned, I do currently work on a project called Changing Chalk, which is a partnership of organisations on the eastern South Downs, so from Eastbourne to the River Ada, working on chalk grassland essentially. If any of you aren't Storrington based and are in the project area and want to get involved with a bit of pollinator conservation, please do feel free to get in touch. We're going to be organising lots of walks and talks over in that area, so my email will be at the end, so please do feel free to get in touch. So we have over 40,000 species of invertebrates in the UK, and they provide this amazing range of free services for us. And these are important ecosystem services such as pollination, which is obviously what I'm here to talk about this evening. But they also carry out amazing things like seed dispersal, decomposition, getting rid of all of our waste, nutrient cycling. They're brilliant predators of pest species, so very good for control of pests. So amazing range of services, but obviously I'm going to talk about pollination this evening. So very briefly, what is pollination? And essentially this is just the movement of pollen from one plant to another. And this can be via the wind, it can be via water or vertebrates, but by far the biggest group involved in this are actually the invertebrates, and recent estimates are that 80% of British wild plants are pollinated by insects. And so why is this important? Well, it's absolutely essential for production of food for human consumption. Many of our crops are dependent on pollination by insects, and this includes things like fruits, onions, sunflowers, rapeseed. And I always like to mention that chocolate is pollinated by a fly, so we definitely need them. And this is worth around £690 million per year in the UK. And having insects provide this pollination service has been shown to increase the yield and quality of crops as well. So pollination is really also important for wider ecosystem function. And when I say that, what I mean is that 80% of our wildflowers are dependent on insects for their pollination. So essentially, it's really required to maintain a healthy and thriving environment. So what are pollinators? Well, they are generally considered to be insects that visit flowers and are known to or are likely to carry pollen between a number of flowers. So the well-known entomologist Stephen Falk has estimated that there are around 6,000 insect species that regularly visit flowers, and we can then therefore consider them to be pollinators. So for example, we've got 4,000 species of beetle in the UK. Only around 250 of these are known to visit flowers. We don't know so much about our sawflies, but it's of the 500 sawflies, approximately half are thought to visit flowers. Flies are a really big family, and 1,500 of them are considered to be pollinators. Again, if we group our butterflies and moths together, we've got about 1,500 species that are flower visitors. Wasps is another really big group, around 2,000 of those visit flowers, and all of our approximately 270 species of bee are known to be pollinators. So our most significant pollinators in the UK belong to 3 orders. The most important is the Hymenoptera, so that includes our bumblebees, our solitary bees, and the honeybee. And these are considered to be commercially significant groups. And this is because bees are purposefully visiting flowers to collect pollen, to take back to their nest to feed their developing young. And for that reason, they're the most effective pollinators. We also have the Diptera, so that's our fly family. And hoverflies, but not just limited to hoverflies, are really important pollinators and are great. Again, they're considered to be commercially significant. And then we also have our Lepidoptera. These aren't considered to be commercially significant, but are really important pollinators of wildflowers. So as I just mentioned, all bees are considered to be pollinators. They visit flowers to get nectar for energy, and the females are collecting the protein-rich pollen to take back to feed their developing young. And there's incredible diversity within the UK bees. They have different nesting habitats and different food preferences, mating habits, habitat requirements, and they can also look really different in appearance as well, which we'll sort of have a little look at in some of the next slides. So we've got over 200 species, over 270 species in the UK. And I always say around or approximately that number of species. We are getting new species in the UK all the time. We have 24 species of bumblebee, over 250 species of solitary bee. And then we have one honeybee, which I'm not really going to talk about at all this evening. They are great pollinators, but we do consider them to be domesticated, so not really a wild pollinator. So here we have our bumblebees. This is a really easily recognizable group. They tend to have large, densely furry bodies. Some have colour bands or different colour tips to the tail, and then some are completely ginger, like our common carder bee here in the top middle. And you can sort of see how they might be good at transferring pollen from one flower to another. And we're generally very familiar with these in our gardens and green spaces. So bumblebees are social. They form nesting colonies from a few dozen workers up to several hundred. And they utilise old small mammal burrows for their nests, or grassy tussocks, sometimes bird boxes, sometimes wood piles. And they have an annual life cycle involving this mass provisioning of pollen to feed their young. They do also take nectar back to the nest, but only in a very limited way. So these are some of our common bumblebees, or what we call the big seven. And these are the queen bumblebees. These are the easiest ones to identify. We also have males and workers that look slightly different. But this is our common seven. So we've got tree bumblebee. It's got this nice ginger thorax with a black abdomen and a white tail. Red-tailed bumblebee is another really nice, easy one to identify. All of the black body with a red tail. Mentioned the common carder bee already. Is all ginger, but it can vary a little bit, and there are a couple of rare carder bees that you need to look at quite closely at some of the colours of the hairs, but generally down here we just have common carder bees. And then on the bottom we've got sort of our mostly black bumblebees with yellow stripes on them, either 2 or 3. Our buff-tailed bumblebee and white-tailed bumblebee can look very similar. They've both got 2 yellow stripes on them, but the buff-tail has, as its name suggests, has a buff tail, whereas the white-tails is much whiter in colour. So if you get a nice fresh one, that is very obvious. Garden bumblebee has a white tail again, but has got 3 yellow bands across the body. Though when it's in flight, it can be quite difficult to differentiate the third one. So the ones at the top of the abdomen and the bottom of the thorax can just look like one band. So you need to look at that a little bit more carefully. And then the early bumblebee is one of our smaller bumblebees. It's got the 2 yellow bands with a nice sort of orangey tip to the tail, and it's much smaller as well. So that's a very quick look at some of our bumblebees. Here we've got a selection of our solitary bees, and as I said, this is by far the biggest group of bees, and are so named because each female has her own nest and lays her own eggs, rather than having the sort of the queen that produces all of the young. Female solitary bees don't rear their young. They work alone to find a nest, provide the nest with a provision of pollen, and then lays her eggs. And then the young emerge the same season or the following year, depending on the species. And as I mentioned, this group is vast. We've got over 250 species in the UK. And many people are not really very aware of this group at all, let alone that there are so many different species. So they do tend to go under the radar a little bit, but they're really fascinating bees. And as you can see from this slide, they are rather variable in appearance. So there's no hard and fast rule to recognizing one. Some are rather wasp-like, while some look a bit more like small bumblebees, and sort of some are hairier than others. So you can see that they vary in appearance quite a lot, but they also vary in their behavior too. So they have different nesting habitats, for example. Some are very niche and associated with particular plants or habitats, while others are much more widespread and can be commonly found in gardens and more urban areas. So very quickly, ashy mining bee, this is a nice one, easy one to identify. Got the two grey bands across its thorax. Again, there's a rare look-alike, but unlikely to see that in sort of our gardens. So ashy mining bee is widespread and locally common through England and Wales, so very common in Sussex. It's often seen nesting in large aggregations, and it nests in short turfed areas and quite bare ground. Then we've got our tawny mining bee. The sort of foxy red pile of this bee makes it really easily recognizable. It forages on spring blossoming shrubs, so things like willows and blackthorns, hawthorns, that sort of thing. Again, it's a ground nester. So if you notice little sort of soil volcanoes in your lawn, it's sometimes this species. If you notice those sort of volcanoes, have a look in about 4 weeks' time to see what's emerging and see if it's this species. Got a hairy-footed flower bee, which I suspect most people are familiar with in their gardens. It looks like a small bumblebee that has this very fast darting flight. It likes to forage on things like comfrey, red nettle, primroses, that sort of thing. And rather than being a ground nester, this is a cavity nesting species. So you might see it entering nests in sort of cracks in stone walls or mortar in brick walls, that sort of thing. On the bottom here, we've got our ivy mining bee. This is the last solitary bee to emerge each season. Ivy is its main pollen and nectar source, though sometimes you see females on other flowers as well. This is a ground nester again, and it likes really bare, sparsely vegetated soils, especially south-facing slopes. In the middle at the bottom there, we've got one of our nomad bees. So this is Guden's nomad bee. And this is a kleptoparasitic species, meaning they lay their eggs in the nests of other species, and mainly other mining bee species. And you often spot these close to the ground, seeking out the nests of ground nesting bees. And this is one of the ones, they're relatively hairless, often with bold, very sort of wasp-like markings, but still a bee. And then we've got our wool carder bee. Medium sized to large bee. It has these sort of yellow abdominal spots. Come back to this one a little bit later on, but it's frequent in gardens in southern England, and is another species that is a cavity nester in pre-existing holes. So that's a whistle-stop tour of our bees. If we want to look at our wasps, we've got over 9,000 species in the UK. 2,500 are thought to be pollinators as they visit flowers. Just very quickly, this is one of our social wasps. So we've got 9 species of social wasp, and that's what we normally think of when we're thinking about wasps. 2 of the sort of common ones that look like this. This is an important crop pest predator, but does also visit flowers, so it's considered to be a pollinator. This is really just a slide to show the variety of wasps that are out there. Don't just think they're like the social wasp that we just looked at. So ruby-tailed wasps, these are cuckoo wasps. They have this lovely, brilliant metallic body, but there's 31 species of these, for example, that all look rather similar, so difficult to identify. These are often seen on flowers or investigating nest holes of its hosts, which is sort of other wasp species. And then we've got a spider hunting wasp here. They tend to be quite slender with this sort of a black or a black-red abdomen with long legs, and they catch a spider and provision each of its nest cells with one paralysed spider. But again, these can visit flowers, so they're considered to be pollinators. Moving on to our flies, the Diptera. So this is how we can tell flies apart from bees and wasps. Flies have 1 pair of wings, whereas bees and wasps have 2. The other things to look out for are hoverflies, and well, most flies tend to have quite big eyes, whereas bees are relatively small, and then differences in antennae as well. But they're found across all habitats, flies are, so you find them in our gardens, meadows, brownfield sites, salt marsh, and as you might expect with this sort of diversity, they also have a really wide range of feeding habits. So some are predators, some are scavengers, some feed on sort of plants, so roots and leaves. Yeah, really diverse order. And this is just, again, an example of some of the different types of flies that we have. So we've got soldier flies, really nice striking coloration for a lot of this species, hence the name. And they are found in a variety of habitats. Larvae can be aquatic or terrestrial feeders on algae or decaying vegetable matter, and the adults are often seen close to water, but on things like umbellifers. Our canopid flies, these are also called thick-headed flies. Again, the adults you'll often see on flowers, and you can also see that these are sort of wasp mimics as well. These this family are parasitoids, so of bumblebees and wasps and some solitary bees, and they're quite amazing that the adult female deposits an egg into the abdomen of the host, so into the bee or the wasp. So quite extraordinary life cycle, but adults definitely visiting flowers. Along the bottom, you know, houseflies. This is a really large group. We've got, yeah, over 200 species, nearly 300 species, and they tend to be quite sort of grey to black, but can be metallic green and blue. And this includes some of our most abundant flies in the UK, particularly those associated with dung. So eggs and larvae are on the dung, but the adults are feed on flowers. They still need that nectar. And then I'll just mention our bee fly there, because I'm sure you've all seen bee flies in your garden. This lovely long proboscis and sort of hovering flight that you see in the spring, often around primroses. Our hoverflies are really important pollinators. We've got over 280 species in the UK. These are great ones to attract into your garden. A lot of them, the larval stages, feed on aphids, So really important for predator control, as well as providing that pollination service. It's estimated that each marmalade hoverfly consumes around 1,000 aphids. I'm not quite sure who worked that out, but it's one of those facts that's bandied about quite a lot. Many of these will mimic bees and wasps as a sort of defense mechanism. You can see in the top middle there, we've got our Volucella bombilans, which, as you can see, looks remarkably like the red-tailed bumblebee that we saw a couple of slides ago, all black with this nice red tail. But you can see it's got big eyes, one pair of wings, and it's, if you can see that photo reasonably well, it's got these lovely sort of hairy antennae as well. This one, the larvae develop as scavengers and larval predators in the nests of bumblebees and social wasps. The adults visit flowers such as sort of thistles and brambles, oxeye daisy, that sort of thing. I'm not going to go through all of these hoverflies, but I will do a couple of them. So bottom left, I'm just going to tell you that this is Calissa aurata, and I've seen this in my garden in Storrington. So that's probably one of my best finds. So this is, yeah, it's lovely, bronzy abdomen with a long black antennae with white tips. Adults are most typically encountered on sort of bramble or rose flowers in wooded settings. My garden is not like that at all. And the larvae develop in wet cavities of mature trees and stumps, so needs a slightly different habitat for the larvae. And I'll mention in the bottom left, bottom middle, we've got one of our Chilosius species, and this is a large genus of hoverflies, and the larvae of which are mostly phytophagous, so they develop inside roots and stems of plants or graze them from the outside beneath the soil surface. So these are real sort of plant eaters. Okay, so our butterflies and moths, 59 species of butterfly in the UK, but over 2,500 species of moths. So lots more moths out there than there are butterflies. Many of the adults visit flowers to get nectar, as I'm sure you are all aware of and have seen in your garden. But larvae have a wider range of requirements, and they often tend to be associated with particular plant species. So, for example, our common blue here lays its eggs on plants such as bird's foot trefoil, some of our clovers, and then the larvae obviously feed on that particular plant. So for a lot of our butterflies and moths, particular plants are really important. Their host plants are really important. Again, with our cinnabar, I'm sure you've seen the larvae feeding on ragwort. So plants are really important. The larval plants are really important consideration. Quickly, I will mention beetles. We've got a lot of beetles, over 4,000 species in the UK. Only a really small minority of these act as pollinators. And if you think about it, it's fairly obvious they've got these modified wings to form protective wing cases. They're not hairy. You can see that they wouldn't pick up pollen as well as some of our bees, but they are flower visitors. So 7-spot ladybirds, you'll often see these on flowers. Quite often in the pursuit of aphids, but they are moving from flower to flower, so have the potential to pollinate flowers. A red soldier beetle, you can see hundreds of these on umbellifers in the summer. So even if they're not picking up much pollen individually, they're obviously just their sheer numbers can mean that there's a lot of movement of pollen between flowers. And then on the bottom right, I've just popped a picture of our pollen beetles in. So these are tiny black beetles and often found in various types of flowers, and they feed on pollen and sometimes sort of stamens and petals of the flowers as well. So that has been a real whistle-stop tour through some of our insect pollinators. Why are we worried about them? Why do I go around talking to people about pollinators all the time? So this is an index that shows changes in pollinator distribution in the UK. So this graph is based on species of bee and hoverfly declines in them, and that's we use them because they are well monitored groups, so we actually have data on these, and this is not a change in abundance, but it's a change in distribution. This shows the changes in the number of 1 kilometre grid squares across the UK in which they were recorded in any given year. So yeah, the graph refers to the overall area where species are found and not directly to their abundance. But the reduction in that graph does show that overall pollinators are becoming more restricted in their distributions, so that on average in any one place the diversity of pollinator species found is reduced. But then interestingly, the graphs on the right hand side show how pollinators have increased or decreased over the long and the short term. And over the long term, 19% of pollinator species have become more widespread, with 49% becoming less widespread. But by contrast, over the short term, a greater proportion of species are increasing and decreasing. So very interesting changes in short and long term distributions as well. Other studies have shown that over a third of bumble species have declined by 70%, 56 moth extinctions, 6 since 1914, 76% of butterfly species have declined over the past 40 years. And just this week, Butterfly Conservation have released their butterfly red list, which states that almost half of UK butterfly species are under threat of extinction. But it does also say that targeted conservation efforts can help. So we'll hold on to that one. So as I mentioned, when I sort of said about the short and the long term, not all species are in decline. So things are never simple pictures. So this is ivy bee. It was added to the British list in 2001, so found in Dorset, and it's since been expanding north and had reached Cumbria by 2018. This map is now out of date because last year it was recorded in Scotland and Ireland for the first time. While there are serious declines in pollinators, a lot of our pollinating species, that some species are doing well and moving north. So why are declines in pollinators happening? It's due to a number of factors, but the most significant cause is the loss and degradation of habitat. We know that 97% of wildflowers have disappeared since the 1930s. And so much of what we've got left is small in size, it's fragmented, it's isolated, and it means that our pollinating insects are unable to move through the landscape easily. On top of that, we have multiple pesticide and herbicide use in agriculture and horticulture, which often have far-reaching consequences for invertebrates beyond just simple target species. So our neonicotinoid pesticides have been shown to have harmful effects on wildlife, so not just bees, but also aquatic invertebrates and even birds. We also know that diseases and parasites from commercially reared honeybees and bumblebees can carry pests and diseases that infect wild populations if they're released into the wild. And also climate change is a real issue for our pollinators as they become decoupled from their associated plants and sort of emerge before or after flowering time. And the same thing is true for our a lot of our bird species as well. As our climate warms, pollinators will need to move north to find ideal climatic conditions. And this often isn't possible if habitats are disconnected, and this makes populations very, very vulnerable. And also climate change also leads to extreme weather at odd times of the year, which can obviously be detrimental for many of our pollinating insects. So what do insects need to survive? What do we need to think about? Well, they need food for adults and larvae. They need somewhere that they can breed. They need somewhere that they can overwinter and shelter, and they often need this mosaic of habitats. So let's have a little look at what adults need. So adults need flowers as a source of protein-rich pollen, which is obviously used to provision their young. And they also need them for sugar-rich nectar. So the pollinator species, its size and shape will all dictate which flowers are used. So hoverflies, for example, lack any specialized mouth parts, and therefore they visit flowers where the nectar is easy to reach. So things like umbellifers, thistles, knapweeds. So that's hoverflies we've got on our top row of our slide there. Butterflies obviously have long proboscis, so are able to reach nectar in deeper flowers, and I'm sure you'll have seen that if you have buddleia in your garden, that butterflies can really love that. Bees have a wide range of flowers they visit. So some species collect pollen from just from a wide range of plants. Others collect from just a few closely related species. So we've got a mining bee called large scabious mining bee, which collects pollen just from the scabious plants. And then there are some species of bee that collect pollen from literally just one plant. So to suit the widest range of pollinator species, a mix of open and deep flowers are required. One of the things to think about is that bees have different length tongues. They're separated into long-tongued and short-tongued species. So garden bumblebee is actually a long-tongued species, so they can reach into deep flowers such as foxgloves, bluebell, comfrey, that sort of thing. Whereas the early bumblebee is a short-tongued species, so needs to feed on more open flowers. But what I love about some of our short-tongued species is that they are also able to rob nectar, and they do this by biting a hole in the bottom of the flower, and so get the nectar that way. So bypass any pollination that they might be undertaking to get their nectar. It's also important to consider that different pollinators are active at different times of the year, some for just a very short period to coincide with the flowers that they use, others for long periods of time over several generations. So a continuity of flowering resource is really important. So trees and shrubs are really important in the spring, particularly species like blackthorn and willows, shown here. Other beneficial species are dandelions, dead nettles, ground ivy, that sort of thing. Then as the summer progresses, legumes are very important. Daisy family in the garden, asters can be very good, and umbellifers, brambles, thistles, all really good for pollinators. And then in the autumn, ivy is probably our #1 late flowering resource. It's absolutely fantastic for providing that final feast for many of our overwintering adults. So yeah, just a quick recap of some of those. If we think about what we can do in our gardens or green spaces, the more flowers we have, the greater abundance of different flowers, the more pollinators we can attract. And the greater diversity of flowers, the more pollinators we can attract. And we need to think about having a continuity of flowers through the whole season. But also, if we're thinking about gardens, avoid chemicals. They're detrimental to pollinating insects, but also to a whole range of other wildlife as well. And I'm also, I'm often asked, you know, what sorts of plants we should have in our gardens. And I suppose the general rules really are that simple plants are better than complex. So all of those sort of double flowered plants that have been bred to have lots of flowers, lots of sort of double flowers, aren't any good for pollinators. They don't produce nectar and pollen. So simple cottage garden plants are definitely really good. And I'm also often asked whether, you know, in our gardens we should have native or non-native plants. And I think the critical thing here to think about is that it's the larval stages that are really need the native species, whether that's in our garden or in the wider countryside. So there is some evidence, but not that much, that native is better than non-native for providing nectar and pollen. But definitely the larval stages, so the food for the larval stages of many of our pollinators, native plants are definitely better. And also always like to tell people that weeds are actually our native wildflowers. So having some what lots of people consider to be weeds is definitely a good thing. I've just mentioned actually that having plants, native plants, is really important for the larval stages of lots of pollinating insects. So many larvae of butterflies, moths and some flies feed on plant stems, the leaves, the roots, and some in particular butterflies feed on just one particular plant. So if we think about one of our chalk grassland plants, butterflies, the small blue butterfly, that just feeds on kidney vetch, so it needs that plant species. And also some hoverflies use plant materials in nest creation as well, so definitely need all of those plants for that as well. And then we need to have a little think about where our pollinators nest. So bees have quite different requirements for nesting. I've mentioned these already. Bumblebees tend to use old mammal holes underground, tussocky grassland or tree holes. But solitary bees have a greater variety of nest sites. There's a lot more species. Some need bare ground or very short turf. So planting wildflowers is really great for that pollen and nectar resource, but they also need short bare turf in areas as well. Other bees are obviously aerial nesters in pre-existing holes, so things like bramble stems, long grass, or in mortar or gaps of walls, and or in bee hotels if you have those in your garden as well. Very quickly, as I won't dwell on overwintering and sheltering habitats quite so much, but they're needed as well. They're often the same features as some of the nesting sites that I've just mentioned. So long grass, tussocky grassland, dead stems, and this is a really important one to sort of think about for gardeners. How to support insects over the winter, and the best thing we can do is not tidy up too much. So leaving some areas uncut over winter will be brilliant. Things like compost heaps and log piles provide really great overwintering habitat too. I mentioned the importance of mosaics earlier on, but just to reiterate the point that having more than one habitat present so insects can complete the whole of their life cycle is really important. So if we think about some of our hoverflies, for example, the adults need nectar resources, but the larvae are aquatic, so they need sort of rotting vegetation at the edge of drainage ditches, puddles, edges of ponds, that sort of thing. And then this is our wall carder bee that we looked at earlier on. The adult feeds on flowers from the pea family, so things like mints, lavenders, bird's foot trefoil, it's a little bit fussy about the types of flowers it will use, but it's also slightly fussy about its nesting habits as well. So it nests in holes in dead wood or old plant stems, but the female also likes to line her nest with fine hairs that she collects from hairy leaf plants such as lamb's ear, shown here. So this particular bee needs all of those things together in a relatively small area to complete the whole of her life cycle. So essentially what we need are bigger, better and more connected areas for wildlife. And this is really sort of where your gardens can come in. This is a fantastic resource that we can all think how we can do things for pollinating insects. And, you know, these should be all well connected through the landscape. So not just through our gardens, so on the road verges, through woodlands, brownfield sites, they all fit together to make this mosaic of habitats so our pollinating insects can move through the landscape. So that's a really brief whistle-stop tour through our insects. I feel like I've talked rather quickly, so I apologise for that, but I wanted to say quite a lot. Couple of references there that I've used in the pollinators. That's my email address if anybody would like to get in contact. But other than that, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take a few questions.
So thank you very much, Alice. There was an awful lot there that I didn't know, and a lot to think about in terms of what we can do to help pollinators in our gardens. Now, Julie has been looking at questions as they've arisen, so I'll hand over to Julie to ask some of the questions that have come through.
Right, thank you. Yes, we've had a couple of questions. So Ruth Stevens wants to know, do we have any bird pollinators in the UK?
I don't think so, no, but I wouldn't like to say 100%. I don't think so. I think we're kind of thinking sort of hummingbirds and that sort of thing when we think of bird pollinators, but you know, there might be one out there that does a bit, but not that I'm aware of. Okay, thank you very much. And the other question I've got was from Phil Huggins, but you may have covered this a little bit anyway, but it says on hoverflies, how do they overwinter and what can we do to make our gardens winter friendly for them? Yeah, I mean, that's actually, you know, the classic one. We often think when we're thinking about what can we do for pollinating insects is like, let's plant some flowers, which is obviously absolutely great. But we do need to think what they need through the whole of the life cycle. And actually having some untidy corners is actually one of the best things we can do for all of our overwintering insects, not just pollinating insects. So not tidying up too much. So keeping some of those stems uncut in the garden will be great. Having an untidy corner. And just having some tussocky grassland as well, that sort of thing, really, really important. Lovely. Well, hopefully that answers Phil. I haven't got any more questions in the chat, so I don't know, Sue, do you want to see if there's any questions?
Does anyone want to raise their hands to get a question asked? In the meantime, while you're looking at your screen and finding reactions, I wouldn't mind asking a question. Oh, but no, Viv's come in here. So do you want to go ahead, Viv?
I just wanted to say that there is one new one come into the chat, but see how you go. There's a new one from Anna Mills. Julie.
Yes, Anna's made a comment that the importance of providing habitats for the whole life cycle is not stressed enough in media. She wasn't aware of the importance of that, so thank you for reiterating it.
Now, I have to say that was something that I hadn't really thought too deeply about. But my question, though, was I know there are a lot of cuckoo bees around, and I know they haven't got the sort of same legs as they are normal bees. But are they also pollinators?
Yes. Yes. So the adults, yes, they will visit visit flowers to get nectar. So essentially bees are visiting flowers to get pollen if they need that for their young, but they are also getting nectar for themselves. So that's their energy, as it were. So yes, they are still pollinators.
So I did have another question. Oh no, there's Tony, you have a question then.
Just a comment really, and see what your thoughts are. I mean, we often talk about the commercial value or the human value of pollinating insects, and what devastating the loss would be in terms of the effect on our crops. The other effect I haven't heard so much about is that actually if we lost our pollinating insects, we'd lose a lot of our pollinated plants, which have an incredible and unpredictable effect on whole ecosystem structure. You can imagine how ecosystems would look without their pollinated plants. There wouldn't be much left. All sorts of things would simply collapse. So I think, the effect of losing pollinators, even if we managed to find food by some other method, would be utterly devastating in terms of all the other services we get from nature.
Yeah, absolutely right, Tony. Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's yes, I mean we obviously talk about our food production, because a lot of that has been sort of quantified. So we can sort of say stats about it. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
So I did have another quick question, actually. I've seen an awful lot of honeybees around at certain times. And it struck me, I mean, unless there's lots of people around me that have got hives, do honeybees live in the wild at all, or would they definitely be coming from a hive?
They will probably be coming from a hive. There are some that honeybees that appear to be free living, but we don't really know how long they can survive for. So it's almost guaranteed that they will be coming from a hive. But honeybees can travel quite a long way. So it's not even that, it has to be a hive in your vicinity. But yes, they're more than likely to be coming from a hive.
But they still do a really good job of pollinating.
They do. I mean, there's when resources are stretched, so like our pollen and nectar resources, we would rather have the wild pollinators being able to use that rather than honeybees. So it can be an issue with competition with honeybees. But there are obviously other benefits to having honeybees. So I think it's, you just got to be careful where they're sited and that sort of thing.
Okay. I've got some more questions coming in the chat. Is that okay to ask some of those?
Yeah.
So Fiona Mills has said that her garden is on sandy soils, at base of the downs, I think. Any tips?
Tips for plants. So I mean, things like if you're really on the sand, things like heathers and broom are really good for insect pollinators. So that's a really good floral resource. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I'm on quite sandy soil as well, and I've got things like I've got some, some asters and Rebecchias that are doing really well. I've got a nice patch of bramble at the bottom of my garden that does nicely too. So yeah, there are things that you can plant, but I have to say I'm not the best gardener. I'm one that has the messy garden.
Thank you. So Sue McPherson has asked, is there anything we should do to maintain the bee hotels we've put up in our gardens, the ones made out of bamboo, etc.?
You don't need to. The issues are that they can be parasitized. So some people sort of rotate them so that they're not out forever. So, but I would say it's kind of part of the natural sort of pest predator sort of system. So you don't need to do anything. But if you want to bring them in for a season and site it somewhere else, that's probably the best thing to do.
Lovely.
Sorry, just to clarify, so when you say they're parasitized, do you mean that the parasites learn where they are and therefore you need to keep them moving.
Yeah. So it's normally wasp species. Find out where they are, and so can basically parasitize. You know, if you've got red mason bees in there or something like that, which it just means you won't have as many red mason bees. But if all the if all your mason bees go, then they're not going to survive, are they, for very long? So but yeah, you can bring them in, you can rotate them, and that's fine.
So is it better to have smaller bee hotels so that you can spread them around, or do they generally like to nest together?
I don't think you need big ones. I mean, I've just got a really small one in my garden, and the red mason bees use that quite happily. I think it's more important that it's where they're sited, so they like to be somewhere quite warm, so sort of south or sort of southwest facing, and without lots of vegetation sort of in the way in front of them, so that the bees got a sort of clear route in and out. But I mean, you see places that have got lots of them, and they seem to be doing absolutely fine. So I think it's more a personal preference rather than anything else.
Lovely. I've got a couple of questions from Hannah Mills. So the first question is, what are the most common solitary bees that we can see in our gardens at this time of year?
Well, I mean, in my garden, the hairy-footed flower bees have literally just sort of gone over. They're very much coming to the end. I mean, I've still got red mason bees, definitely the most popular one I've got in my garden at the moment.
Okay, and Anna's second question was, what time of the year do solitary bees start building nests? Is this all spring and summer long, or mainly end of summer, etc.?
No, it's spring and summer. So as soon as it sort of warms up, the bumblebees, some of the early bumblebees are the first ones to come out. But yes, it's spring and summer. So many different species of solitary bees. So they go throughout the sort of summer season, really.
Okay. We've got Karina. Are there any apps that you would recommend to help with identification?
Oh, I don't know any apps. I don't use them. I mean, the best bee book is Stephen Falk's bee book if you want to invest in a book to try and identify them. But things like the Field Study Council guides are really great, and just a couple of pounds. But yeah, I'm sure there are apps out there, but I have to say I don't use them, so I'm not aware of them.
I would suggest iNaturalist as a really good way of identifying insects. I find the computer version rather than the app better for loading it up and actually looking at things. And what it does is you have to take a picture, and then if you put the picture up, it suggests what it might be, and I found that to be incredibly helpful. And also, at some point, someone who really knows what they're talking about will go in and look at them, and if they confirm your idea or disagree with it, they will tell you. And I found that to be incredibly helpful. So that's called iNaturalist. But don't forget also that if you do identify them, we'd really like you to put the records up onto iRecord, which won't help you with ID, but would certainly benefit the Sussex Wildlife Trust, who are obviously monitoring records for us. Yeah,
I would just say there's actually wonderful Facebook groups. If you're on Facebook at all, there's a fantastic hoverfly group who literally will identify anything you post to them. And there's also a bees, wasps and ants recording Facebook page who are really good as well. So they're very good resources.
Okay, and if we've got time, I've got one final question from Vivian Lucy. She says, Himalayan balsam is good for pollinators, but non-native invasive. What are your views on Himalayan balsam eradication?
Yeah, I'd get rid of it, definitely. I've spent many hours pulling up Himalayan balsam. Yeah, it is a great nectar resource. but it just goes mad, doesn't it? So yes, get rid of it, definitely. Unless you're telling me, are you telling me you've got some in your garden or something, you want to keep it? But no, it just goes mad.
Thanks.
I don't think we want to encourage it to proliferate, do we? So
we did have, we've pulled it all out.
Sorry, Tony?
We did have, but we've pulled it all out. So that's the right answer.
That, definitely, yes, yes. Plenty of other things that can provide some nectar and pollen.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions from anybody, I would like to once again thank Alice for a fascinating talk. And I have to say, I've certainly learned an awful lot, and you obviously have a huge amount of knowledge tucked away in there. So that was brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And I hope everyone found that useful and informative. I certainly did. And we look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully at some of the open gardens, those who are members of the garden project. Julie, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I'll just say to people who are in the Gardens project, I am going to email in the next few days about the iRecord and our key species that I want you to start recording. So I'll be sending out some information to you. All right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, and good night.